You know, the world's not running out of oil. There's all kinds of oil left in all kinds of places. There's 165 billion barrels of the stuff in the Alberta tar sands. And if we run out of that, there's tar sands in the Orinoco. And there's oil 5 to 10 miles below the ocean floor in the Gulf of Mexico, off the coast of Brazil. And if we run out of that, there's oil in shales in places like Wyoming and Colorado. So it's not about running out of oil. We're never going to run out of oil. But what the world is going to run out of, indeed, what the world has already ran out of, is the oil that you can afford to burn. Not just burn in your cars, and 60% of all the oil that we consume is consumed in the form of either gasoline or diesel fuel to power those cars. But maybe more fundamentally, the ways that we burn oil in a million different degrees to which we're not aware of. But most fundamentally, the way we burn oil to run a global economy. And by a global economy, I mean where we produce something at one end of the world, ostensibly to take advantage of cheap labor costs, to be sold at the other end of the world. Because while that model of the economy is based on wage arbitrage, it assumes implicitly and critically that the cost of moving goods and parts around the world is trivial or marginal at best. But no matter how we move goods around the world, whether we move them by air, whether we move them by boat, whether we move them by rail or by truck, we are burning oil. And soon we will no longer be able to do that. Because the cost of raising 4 million barrels a day out of the Canadian tar sands, or the cost of replacing the rapidly depleting Middle East fields with deep water oil, the very prices that will be needed to get that oil out of the ground are the very same prices that will get you right off the road. And that is indeed a world of triple-digit oil prices. We saw a brief glimpse of triple-digit oil prices, and of course people said that that was a fluke. Governments blamed speculators. Speculators blamed the US dollar. Oil companies blamed restrictive drilling conditions. But nobody wanted to acknowledge the inconvenient truth here. And the inconvenient truth here is that since 2005, conventional, i.e. the kind of supply that you can afford to burn, conventional oil supply has not grown, and it may never grow again. That doesn't mean to say that we can't bring new oil out of the ground. But remember one thing. You hear fancy gala press conferences by the Exxons and Chevrons of the world, or by the Brazils of the world, that they've just discovered these huge fields with billions of gallons of barrels of oil trapped in them. But what you never hear about from these companies or these host countries is, you see this field? It's been pumping for 50 years. We pumped her dry, and she's not going to yield any more oil. Yet, that very event, when you add up all of the fields that dry up every year, is worth 4 million barrels a day per year we lose to depletion. Just to put that number in some kind of context for you, we consume about 85 to 86 million barrels a day. So depletion is basically running at 5 to 6%. What does that mean? Well, that means that in the next 5 years, we have to find 20 million barrels a day of new production just so that in 2014 we can consume the same 86 million barrels a day that we consume now. That leaves no allowance for any increase in world demand. There have only been 2 years since 1983 that world demand did not grow. 1983, following the double-dip recession, and last year, the deepest post-war recession on history. If we stay in recession, we have nothing to worry about. Oil demand will not grow for the next 4 to 5 years. But if we have an economic recovery of whatever shape, of whatever pace, we have a huge problem. Because it's not even clear that we'll be able to replace what we're about to lose, let alone make any net additions. And even if we are able to replace the roughly 20 million barrels a day that we will lose over the next 5 years to depletion, understand what we are losing and understand what we are replacing it with. What we are losing is the $3 a barrel cheap oil, the conventional stuff, the light Arab sweet crude that we've been pumping for the last 70 years. What we're going to replace it with is synthetic oil made out of Canadian oil sands. Look at the U.S. Department of Energy or the International Energy Agency, the two sort of official barrel counters, barrel predictors of the world. Look at where they're expecting the largest supply increases in the next 15 years. Not Saudi Arabia, not Russia, Canada. And of course, they're not talking conventional oil, they're talking synthetic oil. They're talking the Canadian oil sands from going from 1.2 million barrels a day to over 4 million barrels a day. It can be done. If Albertans want to turn an area the size of the state of Florida into one giant tailing pond, it can be done. But even if they're so inclined to make that choice, the economics of that is going to require $200 a barrel oil. And $200 a barrel oil is going to translate into $7 a gallon gasoline. So we're going to basically be converting northern Alberta into a tailing pond so some schmo in Chicago can fill up at $7 a gallon in 2014. Because believe me, all of that increase in Canadian oil sand production isn't for people in Red Deer and Calgary, it's for the export sector. But even if that's the case, we're going to see oil prices continue to rise simply because the cost of bringing on new supply continues to grow. In economics, of course, higher prices ration demand. In the oil market, that doesn't seem to work, because just as oil prices have gone from around $20 at the turn of the decade to as much as $147 a barrel just a couple of years ago, the world seemed to get thirstier and thirstier for oil. Why is it that higher oil prices boost demand when they're supposed to restrain demand? Well, the answer to that riddle depends very much on where you're looking at. And this also has huge implications, because where you burn oil is where you find its carbon footprint. Oil demand has peaked in places like Canada, the United States, Western Europe, and Japan. The U.S. will never consume more than the 21 million barrels a day that it did 3 to 4 years ago. Right now, it's about 19.5 million barrels. That's not where the demand for oil is going to be coming from, and that's not what drove oil up over $100 in the first place. Guess where you think the demand for oil is growing the most rapidly? Probably most of the folk here would say China, and certainly China's one of the strongest. But I know a place where the demand for oil grows even faster than China. Last year, OPEC, Mexico, and Russia consumed 14 million barrels a day of oil, 2 Chinas. These countries also just happen to account for 65% of world oil production.